two things. The missing title is Unfinished Movements, which is a title of one of the pieces in the exhibition. That was about obsolescence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it runs through the work in the exhibition, and it's obviously also something that I got interested in relation to the material that I found, because it was also slides and Super 8. And in fact, I had been interested for quite a long time in the sort of materiality of images, or the sort of structural sort of underside of images, and the information and kind of what that contains beyond the information of what the image shows us. So there's obviously kind of, we see something on the image that kind of we read as representation. And then there's another kind of communication, which is to do with its materiality, with its medium. And I was quite interested in that, especially in relation to the notion of the post-medium that Rosalind Krauss introduced in relation to this work by Brochars, Marcel Brochars, A Voyage on the North Sea, which is also to do with a sea journey. But it's a work that exists kind of at the same time as a book and a film. And it's not just a journey on the North Sea, but it's also a journey through mediums. So the film, the 16mm film, shows amongst other images, shows a painting of a journey on the North Sea, and kind of sort of moves into the painting to show the surface of the painting itself, but obviously as a film. So it's sort of these layers of medium within one medium, and this is something that I was quite interested in relation to the material I found, and the video that I'm presenting in the exhibition, or that's kind of that's a part of this sort of modular work. Uses a lot of different types of images, which are both contemporary and archival, and sort of stages them against each other. In this case, quite literally, sort of me in this place and images of the place, but it also mixes kind of quite crisp HD footage with much rougher Super 8 films within the same kind of frame. And yeah, I think that's probably all of the statements.
Oh, yes, it is. So the next term is movement. So one of the meetings of our practices has to do with thinking about movements, the movements that take place. Of course, when a place changes, people move, but goods move also. Capital, time makes things move, and also political regimes, of course. You know, political movements are a very important form of movement, and there's one movement that we particularly could not avoid is the movement of revolutions. So Uriel and I were both working in our own completely separate ways about somehow the consequences of the 1952 Egyptian revolution. It's called revolution was a coup made by Nasser, General Nasser. And then we started talking together. Well, first of all, we didn't even meet. We were both in Egypt at the same time, but we didn't even meet. We just heard about each other somehow, and started sending things to each other, and then started talking back in London, literally in relationship to these two practices that were using that event as an anchor point. We decided to collaborate and to make an exhibition together, but literally that works in that way. So Uriel would do something, I would do something else, and something else would be done. It would just allow us to think further than ourselves. And in this process, 2011, beginning of 2011, there was another revolution. So we were always, as anyone is, but we were of course faced with, what do you do when you're making a project about a place, and that place is just completely changing in front of your eyes. You cannot not integrate the present. You have to somehow deal with it. So one clue for me was a film by Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Huet called Too Early, Too Late, 1981. that I'd already been working with actually for a while. And I had interviewed Straub about this film in October 2010. So just to say so, like in general about this film, like some of you have heard of this film maybe? It's a bit of a like cult thing. It was shot in 1980, so the year that Mubarak actually went to power. Too Early, Too Late investigates the changing relationships between people and land, literally territory, through the history of two revolutions. One, the French Revolution, and two, the coming, the potential Egyptian revolution, let's say. The French Revolution is looked at through a text by Frederick Engels. It's actually a letter to his disciple Kautsky. And the second part, it's a diptych, right? The second part that looks at Egypt uses one text, which is one paragraph from this book by Mahmoud Hussein called Class Struggle in Egypt. So the first edition, this is just a picture of the first edition, of course it exists in English. And it's literally just one paragraph that is actually there, which maybe you can even read. What is interesting about this film and why it really offered a clue was that the film sets to talk about something, like a huge subject like revolution, and it starts with an 8-minute shot from a moving car driving around the Place de la Bastille in Paris. So in a very structuralist way, actually setting subject and object in exactly the same tone. So we're looking at revolution through the revolutions of the camera. And that, for me, was a clear hint at, one, how the filmmaker decided to position himself clearly in relationship to revolution and to the struggles of Egypt. And also, secondly, towards the fact that, of course, revolution is a movement and it's ongoing. Another footnote on this film that I think is quite interesting is that this book that was used by Jean-Marie Straub and Denis was initially published. That publishing house, François Amasfero, is the one publishing house in Paris that published all the lefty revolutionary texts in the 60s and 70s, like really important in France. He was sued like 14 times and they tried to shut him down, I don't know how many times. But his grandfather was actually one of the most famous Egyptologists French Egyptologist in Egypt, who is responsible for most of the Egyptian collection in the Louvre. So was responsible for taking this enormous amount of stuff to France. So that's movement. Oh no, there's something else. This is actually 1 out of 5. Well, it's a piece made out of 5 prints that is in the exhibition that was made in the time when the Egyptian revolution started last year. It was exactly the time when Uriel and I were supposed to go to Egypt to put up a show that we'd only put up actually in December last year. So in this process of actually being stuck at home and being inundated by media coming from Egypt and totally unable to go, like this kind of overwhelming of the present, I made this series of works that has to do, I mean, it's very simply, it's an overprint of the front pages of newspapers, but just the space that Egypt took on the front pages of newspapers within the sphere of influence. So it gets, I mean, obviously at the beginning of the revolution, all the front pages were absolutely full, and then at some point it shrinks a little bit, and then it gets bigger again. So it's literally how media is occupied, and how the imagination of media is also occupied with the revolutionary movement into the present. And each day that I printed, I used a different color. So literally to talk about.
What newspapers are they?
So I was collecting the newspapers that I felt were most relevant to the Egyptian situation. So National Egyptian newspaper, of course, The Guardian. I mean, it used to be a British protectorate. The New York Times, in relationship to, of course, I mean, American influence is impossible to not talk about. Then I had an Israeli newspaper, super important for that, and actually I think there's a few of them that have also Algerian newspaper. So kinds of movements.
Different kinds of movement. Yeah, I'm going to talk about different kind of movement. Actually, initially, kind of thinking about the movement through one's work, and kind of how we might start a work or a project, and how one thing leads to another. I think is quite interesting. But also what I find interesting, and I will talk about it more specifically, is how sometimes the sort of movement to the side and the tangents leads us to interesting things. And this is also something that connects to research in archives, where you might be looking for something very specific, but you come across something else that is also interesting. That's kind of not relevant, or maybe it's slightly relevant, but it's to the side. And this kind of sideways movement, I think, can be very interesting. In this case, it was a similar experience of me kind of researching around the Suez Canal and around the story of the ships and what happened with the negotiations as well, in order to kind of try to reopen the Suez Canal as quickly as possible. And I spent a lot of time at the British Library looking through these documents and ordering things, and then kind of through my search, this thing came up around the zoological phenomenon of migrating species that started to migrate from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean since the opening of the Suez Canal. So this is a kind of man-made canal that creates a water bridge between two seas and allows for a kind of natural movement or natural migration, or an artificial natural migration to occur. And kind of initially I was interested kind of how that relates in terms of the temporality of these fish and their very extremely slow movement through the canal while the ships were stuck. But another aspect that I found extremely interesting is how zoology talks about this migration in kind of very anthropomorphic terms, where there's a kind of influx of foreign species in the Mediterranean taking over the habitat of local species. So I decided to draw most of these species in relation to the rest of the work, and kind of try to think about these different kinds of
Did you say what the piece was called?
The piece is called Lesseps Migrants, and so they're named after Lesseps, who was the mastermind, the French sort of entrepreneur who conceived and saw the building of the Suez Canal through. And another thing kind of I was interested in relation to that is the relationship between natural history and human history, and how sort of nature can be a witness to human history. And it's something to do with representation and kind of who produces images and who looks at things happening, and what would a gaze be that is not a human gaze witnessing an event in time, in a place and in time, and how would that representation work is something I was also quite interested in. Next, Carol.
Narrative. So, narrative somehow for us has to do with relationships. I mean, obviously the relationship with storytelling, between making exhibitions, making works and storytelling, and also relationships between fact and fiction. So quite often the narratives that are being circulated around images that we look at are somehow either wrong or slightly adjusted or totally specific to why or where they were circulated. Right? So the narratives of things that make them readable is not something that we can entirely always trust. So I mean, I'm showing these two images because these are two, well, I mean, they're either building sites or archaeological sites, right? So in Alexandria, Alexandria is a city that is full of archaeological sites, of course, right? Because because there's just so much stuff. But then, of course, building sites and archaeological sites looks exactly the same. So the construction of the future and the uncovering of the past looks the same in terms of the practice, the human practice that is. This particular building site that I was photographing while I was there on a residency, so that's a year and a half ago, I kept on going back to this building site and photographing it every day. It was where they were building a new police headquarters in Alex. And then in the process of this photographing, and I was somehow researching also in the Archaeological Institute, the French Archaeological Institute there, which is called CEA, I actually found out that this was a site where they had found this temple to an ancient goddess called Bastet, who's the goddess who's half a cat. Maybe you have seen statues or pictures of her. She's got the head of a cat. So they had uncovered this amazing temple with these fantastic sculptures, like, with intact colors of the cat goddess. And because it was the police headquarters, they'd taken all the objects out and then decided to flatten the ground to continue building the police station. So it made even more, well, I mean, in a way that it's just pure luck, right? This complete implication of the making of the future and the making of the past. And the fact that these two things are actually not that distinct. So what I was looking at was not just the building of the new police station, but was also the erasure of a particular history of Alexandria.
But they managed to retrieve everything before
they took the objects out and then destroyed the temple.
Oh, they destroyed the temple?
Yeah.
They didn't replace it somewhere else?
As far as I understand, no. No, and they also did something else which was quite interesting, is that the finding only got published a day after they had already prepared the ground for the foundations of the new
Are
building.
there images of the temple?
I don't have images of the temple. I only found photographs of one, well, it's kind of an opening. It was a basin that was published alongside the finding. And then there are images of the statues, of the cats. That are quite beautiful. And I'm probably going to be in the museum at some point in my life. What else do I have to say about this? Or maybe somehow going back to this notion of existing conditions. So narrative and the way we intervene into narrative, I think, also very much as artists, also, right? We construct narratives, and in that we're implicated in the production of the real. We do intervene and create the new existing conditions that other people will take somehow for granted, perhaps or perhaps not. But these boundaries between the site of the work and also what is existing or pre-existing. You know, I mean, also in some ways what Uriel was mentioning in relationship to nature, notions of nature, right? The eye that is outside us. And these lines are extremely fine, and I think extremely interesting in relationship to action, right? In relationship to what you want to do in your life. That's my thing about narrative, I think.
I was just going to add a few things. We haven't really shown any installation shots of the work, as you can see the work tomorrow properly installed. But I did want to show one installation shot in relation to the notion of narrative, because it's a story, essentially the story of these 14 ships and what happened to them. But what I was interested in was that this story is not told officially. It's not kind of existent. So it's up for grabs, and you're allowed to kind of speak about it any way you want. And I wasn't interested in reproducing this gap and kind of reproducing a story that could neatly be reinserted into a historical narrative. But I was interested in the way that these fragments of this story exist in the world, and how we might come across them, and how I came across them, and kind of allowing these fragments to construct a narrative in a different way that isn't a linear narrative that says this is what happened and this is what happened afterwards. So that escapes notions of chronology, notions of causality, and constructs, in a sense, a setting for a story that is produced internally in the viewer, that also implicates the viewer in the act of storytelling. And in relation to this idea of sort of fact and fiction and what is often referred to as the blurring of boundaries between fact and fiction, which is actually something that I'm not that interested in or that I don't find so useful. I often think about sort of how maybe notions of construction of facts or fictions is a way to combine these two terms, kind of thinking about how facts are as constructed as fictions, which again is quite obvious, but it allows for the construction within the work of real elements and constructed elements that I wouldn't call fictitious. They are also kind of real constructed elements. And I don't make a distinction between them, between kind of images that I created or constructed and images that I found and maybe manipulated. And then the final thing I wanted to mention in relation to narrative is this notion that I kind of already alluded to of a spatial montage that produces a narrative, so that narrative isn't taking place just in time, in a chronology of time, but is taking place in a space. And this is a way to think about how an installation might function, not just as a kind of arrangement of images, but as a way to tell a story in a kind of exploded manner, and what that might be, or what that might lead to. And to kind of stay within this way of sort of explosion, and you pick up the pieces and you tell a story. I was also thinking about the way when we tell a story, each time we tell a story in a different way. Slightly we change words, we tell a different version of it. So with this work that has been traveling quite a bit over the last year or so, I decided that each time the work is shown, it's actually a new version of the work. So there is there's no kind of work or installation that is the definitive version. It only exists as a version. And that's a very important aspect in relation to the authority of a story and the kind of authority, especially of historical stories, that want to be the definitive version, and there isn't one.
Which version is this?
This is version 10 tomorrow.
We have one last term, which we're going to do a bit differently. Our last term is topology. Again, there's many things we've said that lead to this idea of topology, or topography also. So relationships to place. We're going to do this as a reenactment of an interview between, so I went to Paris and interviewed Jean-Marie Straube about this film, right, that he'd made in 1980. I interviewed him in October 2010, so 3 months before the Egyptian Revolution, and he absolutely believed that Egypt would rise again and revolt against their oppressor. So it's a fragment of the interview that I think talks more eloquently than anything we could say. So Aurelio is going to be me, and I'm going to be Straube.
And you clearly choose to place yourselves in relationship to these revolts. Did you go to Alexandria in 1981 when you were filming? Had you already decided not to film there?
We'd been there a year earlier. We had already been in 1973. We went 3 times before going back and forth to film all this mess. We went twice for another film, and then we went back. And then we went back again to find the locations, the villages on which there were informations given to us by the 2 Egyptian writers. And at this point, we went back 6 months or a year later to film. We didn't decide anything. It was them, their book, Mahmoud Hussein's text, that did for us. They placed themselves later, after the Alexandria riots, because they wanted to speak about something that actually led to Nasser.
How was this translated to how you placed yourselves in the filming? There is a lot of consideration in the distance of each scene, between the camera moving or staying still, with the fact that people do not seem to be disturbed by its presence. How does one choose to appropriate a position for the camera?
This is the least that you can do when filming. You need to go there and walk around. You need to walk around a place or a village 3 times and find the right topographic, strategic point, in a way that one may be able to see something, but without destroying the mystery of what one sees. But this isn't specific to this film. This is the case in all our films.
Especially the topographic point. I really recognize this in the film Sicilia.
But this is what cinema is. The writer gives information that he puts down on paper that come out of archives. The same thing happens to Engels, who started from Kautsky's text and said to him, "You didn't understand anything." And he enumerates all these facts. All the facts that he refers to become the list of grievances of the French Revolution. So we went to the archives here in Paris and we got those lists. We had 2 big piles, carefully tied with ribbons, that barely anyone had ever opened. We unwrapped them cautiously and checked the facts. And then we went from the north of France to the south to see where all this happened, where it had taken place, what was left of it. And what is left of it? Nothing. Of course nothing. There is nothing left. The topography, nothing else.
But does the topography speak? And can it have a voice?
Well, cinema is or should be the art of space, even though a film exists only if that space is able to become time. But the basic work is always space. As Mallarmé said, nothing will take place but the place. So any questions, please ask.
Or comments?
Or comments?
The change of format from place to place, the new show, the new show, the new show. Have you any thoughts on, or information perhaps, on what dictates that? Is it a sense of architecture, new architecture? Is it a sense of just wanting to redo and review?
Yes, some of it takes place in the exhibition space in relation to the site specificity of the space itself, and then I kind of travel with quite a lot of the elements and I leave certain things out or put certain things in. And some of it is dictated by me working with the images and finding new material and incorporating it into the narrative of the piece, and then figuring out it's an equilibrium, because what I'm using, I did find a huge amount of material that wasn't official, obviously not in official archives, but through tracking down crew members and being kind of obsessed about this for quite a long time. And then it's a huge part of the work is this kind of selection process and this montage. So I'm only using a tiny amount of the material. It's like the tip of an iceberg. And that selection always makes a particular point, and I kind of want to change that. So I sort of feel like maybe I've made that point, I want to make another one.
So there's constant research going on the development of the mass of stuff that you have, in a sense.
Yes, at the moment, as long as I'm showing the piece, I want to keep the work, in a sense, the work open, not just in terms of this condition of showing the work in a different way and with in a kind of new configuration, but also with new elements every time, but to kind of keep it open for myself and kind of keep engaging with it. I do wonder that at some point I'll have to stop, and it's sort of
that's what I was going to ask you.
When
where do you put the full stop?
Yeah, it's kind of deferring. Obviously, kind of knowing when to stop is a really important thing in kind of making art. With each piece, you sort of need to think about when is it finished, even when, yeah, I mean, it happens with every piece, whether it's a painting or an installation, the decision to say that's it. And I've deferred this, I'm very aware of that. But the work that I do show is finished.